Okay, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about the second half of Chapter 5, an unusually long chapter in this book, especially early in this book. And it is especially noteworthy because the chapter itself, as now that we've seen, is relatively sparse of action, and it's filled with all sorts of various events inspiring various moods, but mostly it serves to prolong the anxiety that the narrator feels as he is dreadfully awaiting his interview with Dr. Bledsoe. And so we find him still sitting in the church, listening to the very inspiring speech by Reverend Barbee from Chicago, and then ultimately unable to withstand any more of the emotions that are being churned up within him. He runs out of the church before the service is over, and walks, through the empty campus towards the administration building, where one presumes in Chapter 6 he will finally have that interview with Dr. Bledsoe. So the action of the chapter is relatively minimal, but the feelings that are generated are really quite stirring. And I think it's partly not just to give us a break from the action, but to demonstrate or to kind of show off his linguistic ability, his eloquence in this chapter, that we see Ellison really indulging in, luxuriating in both the implicit and the explicit eloquence on display. Obviously, first we have the speech from Reverend Barbee, where he tells us a very inspirational story of the founder from his very beginning, ultimately till his final moments, and then the aftermath as well. And while that is going on, we see the character going through a variety of emotions. He feels, as the Barbee's speech inspires the audience and fills them with the sense of greatness of their collective mission to found this college and generate generations of productive, upward mobile African Americans who are doing all these things essentially by themselves and for themselves. While all of that is going on, the narrator feels increasingly mournful because he is obviously worrying that he's going to be exiled, banished, kicked out of this kind of intellectual resort, this Eden that he is in. And at the same time, he's also recognizing, while he's feeling mournful about it, he's also feeling resentful and increasingly disconnected. And so, which brings up one of the themes of this chapter, and really one of the themes of the book, which is this notion of connection versus disconnection. And you see that all throughout the chapter. The feelings of connectedness with his surroundings and disassociation from them. You see it even in the techniques of Barbee's speech. Barbee is a very gifted speaker, and he makes connections with his audience. He says, this wasn't just the founder's story, this is your story too. You escaped along with the founder, and you are building this dream, making this dream a reality, not just the founder. And in addition, he talks later about how there are even some people in the audience who were there at the early days. He refers to the gray-headed audience members. And so Barbee has a way of connecting his story to the audience so that they feel as if they are participants in it. One of the interesting things that Ellison does, and not all authors do this, so we should not take it for granted that we'll see this in every narrative, but Ellison is not content just to tell us Barbee is an eloquent speaker. Ellison makes that extra effort, which takes a lot of artistic courage to actually give us Barbee's speech so that we can judge for ourselves whether or not if it is in fact eloquent. If any of you have read The Scarlet Letter, you'll remember that Hawthorne constantly tells us the Reverend Dimmesdale gives these amazingly inspirational speeches and sermons, but we are always, when those are given, on the outside of the church with people like Hester, who's not allowed in, and so we have to take Hawthorne's word for it that it was in fact inspiring. And there you can make the claim, I think fairly credibly, that Hawthorne demonstrates kind of lack of artistic courage, not willing to risk writing a speech and having it be judged ineloquent. Ellison, however, once again, as further evidence of his desire to put everything imaginable in this book, almost a kind of linguistic excess gives us these speeches. And in fact, they are. I mean, I think any fair assessment of them would have to agree that they are eloquent. And so, you get it creates a mood that is very inspirational. And as the founder obviously dies, it's a very mournful one as well. And even within these moods that are both inspirational and mournful, on polar opposite ends of an emotional spectrum, Ellison also creates a kind of an undercurrent mood, one of anxiety, while the anxiety, of course, that the narrator feels waiting for his interview with Bledsoe, but another anxiety too that is kind of ominous, because within this speech he talks about how the founder had enemies, not just white enemies, but enemies among his fellow African Americans. And in addition, when the founder collapses on stage or ultimately dies, he talks about notes of terror and turmoil and commotion. And these sorts of moods, these sorts of these feelings that are a little disquiet in the audience, different from feeling inspired, different from feeling mournful, it's an undercurrent that is hard to overlook. It's obviously something Ellison puts in there at this rather contemplative time to keep us a little bit on edge. So in addition to the theme of connectedness versus disconnectedness, we also see the power of language once again on display. Explicitly, Barbie is giving this speech, which makes the people in the congregation feel these emotions quite strongly. Very poignant speech. And at the same time, Ellison is demonstrating the power of language himself by showing all of these techniques that he has, putting them on display, in effect, almost to overwhelm the reader. We are beyond inspired and impressed, but at times it's really hard just to take it all in. And one thing I want to focus on in this part of the chapter in particular are some of the really amazing images that Ellison is able to develop. One from a little bit from last chapter, the first part of chapter 5 that I want to remind us of is on page 122 of the edition that we've been reading. And on that he talks about how the founder is escaping from some people who have gathered presumably to attack, if not lynch him. And so he's being hidden in a wagon full of cotton. So he's in the midst of this bale of cotton, and obviously there's no air there. To keep himself from suffocating, the image on page 122 is he uses the barrel of a shotgun, an opened shotgun where it is not ready to be shot, and breathes through that as a breathing tube. And that's a pretty powerful image, because on the one hand, obviously the shotgun is providing him life, but on the other, for that to provide him life, he has to put the barrel of the shotgun in his mouth, and that obviously is a very disturbing image. So it's one that's both life-giving with the threat of life annihilating simultaneously. It's a pretty powerful image that doesn't have to be part of the book at all. And so here Ellison has this notion. How does he create? How can he make use of this amazing image? And it fits seamlessly within the book, and it becomes an indelible way to kind of remember something about that founder, something about this portion of the book. So when an author is able to develop images like that, that's pretty special. And Ellison puts several into each chapter that are equally memorable. In this one, for example, as the train that the founder is on is ascending this mountain, the Dr. Bledsoe and Reverend Barbie realize that the founder is dying. So as the train ascends towards heaven, that's when the founder dies, at the very moment that the North Star is dimmed by a cloud or something. And so the idea of a blinking North Star or the eye of heaven closing in sadness at the precise moment that the founder dies is very moving. And then on the very next page, obviously Ellison, not content just with that image, takes it one step further and has a falling star appear just at that moment, which represents a single tear falling from that North Star's eye. So it's a very moving image. And then in addition to that, we get the image that we discover that Reverend Barbie himself has, once again, we have, kind of building on this image of eyes and sight and vision. Reverend Barbie, it turns out, when his glasses fall off because he himself has a bit of a health mishap and collapses when at the end of his speech and his glasses come off, the narrator realizes that Barbie is blind. And the idea of a blind preacher in literature is a trope that is ages old. We see it in ancient Greek literature all the time. The idea of a blind seer. In the plays of Sophocles, there is the blind seer named Tiresias, and the idea there is that these figures are denied human mortal sight because they have been endowed with a kind of quasi-divine inspirational sight. They can see beyond the mere real world. We ourselves, because we're mortals, we're distracted by all the bright lights and fast-paced life around us. And so while we can see what's in front of us, we can't see what's beyond us. And blind seers in literature have that extra sight that they can see beyond what we can perceive. And so the question then becomes, is Barbie one of these seers? Is that what Ellison means? Or is it exactly the opposite? Barbie is merely blind, and so he can't see he can't understand that the things he is saying are simply wrong because he can't see the truth. And so we have to figure out, is it the case that Barbie has this semi-divine sight, or if Barbie is blind and instead living in a state of ignorance? And that's something that another image that Ellison uses in this part of the chapter. And then the final one, which is kind of interesting, is that at the near the end of the service, when the narrator can't take any more of this notion that he's about to be exiled from this community, that he is now realizes just how much he loves. In fact, he feels the kind of guilt and is beginning to own his responsibility for his own actions, his own contributions to his being exiled. He runs out of the church, and among the things he sees is a bird perched on that statue, the statue of the founder, in the process of lifting a veil from the face of the slave child who is kneeling at his feet. And we talked early in the book about whether that statue, in fact, the narrator says, it's unclear because the veil is kind of like in mid-position. So it's unclear whether the founder is unveiling the slave's sight or is actually blinding the slave by lowering a veil over its eyes. And so that image has some ambiguity. Here, when we see that image again, there's a bird perched on the hand of the founder, and the bird's face is towards the founder, but its back end, its tail end, its butt, if you will, is being waved in the face of the slave. And so there too, a very poignant image filled with all sorts of suggestive import. The idea of the elites essentially disrespecting, keeping down, oppressing those beneath them. And so here we have, in this chapter, a whole bunch of images that are really indelible. And so what I would like us all to do as we read on, reading chapter 6 for next time, is look for these images. And in addition to those, also look for where we see Ellison demonstrating great linguistic ability. So in addition to artistic insight and a desire to dazzle us with his imagery, notice also the way that he uses language, the power of his language. The chapter of the book is filled with people who use language to achieve their ends, to move, to manipulate, and here we see some too. And one last notion I think is probably worth noting is that Bledsoe himself, if you'll remember from the earlier in the chapter, when the founder first collapses, Bledsoe takes the stage and assures the audience that everything is just fine, and that the founder is just tired, even though Bledsoe knew at the time that the situation was much more dire, the illness of the founder was much more significant than that. And so here you have Bledsoe deceiving, acting insincerely, and so just on the just on the moments before we have to see Dr. Bledsoe with the narrator for this interview, we have great concern about Dr. Bledsoe's trustworthiness, his ability to be sincere. And so you have all of these various things going on at the same time, and it's probably worth keeping those in mind as we read ahead for chapter 6. And so keep looking for those images and the the mood of the chapters that is brought up to you, and follow these themes as well. And then finally, of course, obviously, the linguistic, the exquisite linguistic ability that Ellison puts on display. It's really quite amazing. And so next time we'll talk about chapter 6, and that'll be it.